The global energy transition places uneven financial burdens on developed and developing countries. Determining who bears these costs requires clarifying the roles of governments, the private sector, and international funds to achieve an equitable transition. Solutions must promote climate justice while providing support for vulnerable economies. What financial mechanisms can ensure developing nations are not overburdened by the transition? How can climate funds and development banks support economies at risk of disruption? What role should private sector investments play, and how can they be incentivized?
So that gives us the frame of our conversation. And our intention is to succeed where others might be stuck by drawing out some of the actions that can help to address the challenges of global equity and climate justice. Our conversation comes after the recent conclusion of COP29 in Azerbaijan and the mixed success of new financial targets. A new collective fund of 300 billion for developed countries to take the lead on delivering against the $1.3 trillion that developing countries want. Before we hear from our panelists, I'd like to hear from you in the audience. I'd like to tap into your expertise. So take out your phones and go to the app, the AD app, go to AD Connect, and answer this poll question. What is the most significant challenge in funding the global energy transition? Is the app working? Oh, you've already voted, okay. Inadequate. Okay. Okay. I think, no? Are we good? Okay. Well, okay. So there we are. This is the wisdom of the room. And so I'll come to you, panelists, because we see what seems to be the prevailing opinion, the challenge to a just and equitable global energy transition is inadequate international financing mechanisms. So what would you think, and I'll start with you, Professor Lopez, what do you think is the most important consideration for ensuring that the energy transition is equitable, just, and effective?
Well, we have spent a lot of time with the methodology that doesn't work anymore. We are having COPs every year, so it's not to be forgotten that it's COP 29. And that basically demonstrates that we have not made enough progress in implementing the most important measures, including the Paris Agreement, mostly because it's voluntary-based and also because the characteristics of the methodological process are not compatible with the requirements and the urgency. So as a result, we have a huge level of frustration that is building up. There is mistrust in the process. People go and try to negotiate money, targets, commitments that don't make much sense when it comes to implementation. And if you look into what is actually being delivered, we can even identify very easily that the delivery is the subject of huge problems of accountability. So what is actually declared as delivered, which is very little in relation to commitments, which is very little in relation to needs, is actually not commensurate with the reality. It's a bit of a fabrication.
But when we think about that, especially as you call it a fabrication, the poll tells us that in addition to inadequate financing, there's also resistance. And this resistance, when you listen to all the COPs, even as we come to the 29th COP, there seems to be a historical resistance, but also a defensiveness against ensuring that there is a just and equitable financing for the people, for the parts of the world that bear the largest, who are most exposed, one, to the vagaries of the energy transition.
Well, you know, the fundamental pillar of climate justice is admitting that the development that we have in the world today, where we are in terms of technological development, consumer patterns, and you name it, has been possible with destruction of certain characteristics of climate and a threat to the environment that is incompatible with future needs. So that's the pillar. And then we go into who is responsible for it, and obviously we know who is responsible for it. Is, you know, the processes of industrial revolution are very much part of the reasons why we end up in the situation where we are. And certain parts of the world, certain geographies have benefited from it, others didn't. Which basically translates into, instead of discussing financing the way we do, we should be discussing who is carbon responsible for the situation we are. And therefore you have countries that have a carbon debt and countries that have a carbon credit. So if we just equate it in those terms, the discussion is about countries that have a carbon credit getting something from the ones that have a debt.
Mm. And so, Mr. Strauss-Kahn, I come to you because Professor Lopez has set you up nicely with the carbon credit and carbon debt paradox, but also because the feeling in the room, and given your experience, is that we don't have adequate financial instruments.
Well, thank you. I would like first to jump on what Carlos just said. I think that most people now accept the idea that developing countries are disproportionately burdened with the deleterious consequences of climate change they contribute a little to create. So this is a big progress because it's the first step. Acceptance of the situation is the first step. And creates, of course, this justice problem you were talking about. Even if justice problem doesn't end here. There's also an intergenerational justice problem. What are we going to pay now versus what is going to pay later? And that's another part of the justice question. But to come to your point, which is about financing and which appears when you ask the audience what they seem to be the most interesting problem, I think that there's a naive way, in my perspective, to answer the question, which is to say, well, we have to find new kind of tools, new flows to organize things. We have green bonds, we have blue bonds, why not pink bonds or purple bonds? We can imagine a lot of the financial technology is endless. But from my point of view, that is not the main point. The main point is, do we really consider that the future of mankind is at stake or not? If not, this meeting is useless. If yes, then we have to imagine something which is very different. And those who know me will not be surprised that I come at this point to SDRs. COP, one after the other one, and the last one was one of the most deceptive, struggled to find $100 billion with they got it in pledge, never in reality. The possibility to finance what is on with SDR is about $1,000 billion a year. I know all the arguments against this solution, and there are many. But again, arguments are one thing, the need is another thing. And most of the arguments against the solution financing the energy transition through SDR are right, corruption, inadequate investments, things like this, but they hold also for any kind of financing. Whatever the source of financing, you have this problem. So the point is, do we really want to accept the idea that 1,000 billion a year is 1% of global GDP? So if everything goes into inflation, that's 1% of inflation. 1% of inflation is not something without importance, I won't say that. But again, is really the future of mankind at stake? If yes, what is 1% of inflation? So I really think that the point is not to invent new kind of thing, but to use the tool we have. The problem, of course, is the political will to do this. My point is that we don't miss, there's not a problem of funding, but a problem of willingness to fund. And then we come to the political problem, which certainly is the most important in this story. We are not in a period where multilateralism has some strengths, and some, on the contrary, and so it's very difficult to imagine a collective or multilateral solution. But without such a solution, there won't be a way to solve the problem. So for me, the question, I will just end with this, is not that much who bears the cost of energy transition, but will energy transition take place? And I'm not quite sure it's going to be the case, because the willingness to do so is not obvious. The different stakeholders, developing countries and advanced economies, public sector and private sector, have interests which are not aligned. And so when they're not aligned, it's very difficult to find a collective solution. And there's no individual solution to such a problem. So unless something very damageable happens, which will force the countries to go back to some form of cooperation, as it happened in 2008 with the subprime crisis, and as it happened also somewhat with COVID, some kind of catastrophe. Then people, governments, private sector, everybody's afraid, they want to work together. But unless we have that, or until we don't have that, nothing will really happen. We need something like that to really make the political barrier, to destroy the political barrier, the reluctance of doing something. And if we come to this point, then the financial tools are not difficult to elaborate.
Okay, so let's say that something drastic has happened, and all these people who have been unwilling to work together now see the need to work together. How do you go about aligning these different interests?
Well, when really people are afraid, the interests align alone. They're afraid and they want to find a solution. Again, come back to the subprime crisis, the last big crisis we had in the world, which has been solved by cooperation. When the idea came out that from the IMF that the solution was to have around 2% fiscal deficit everywhere to avoid a crisis, many voices say, oh, it's not possible. We did it and we avoid the crisis. If really we come to a point, and maybe it's not that far when you see what's happening in the pergélisol melting and in this kind of things. If we come to a point where the consequences, very deleterious of the climate change, makes that people in the street begin to say, we have to find a solution, then government will move. And if governments move together, then the private sector will follow. So again, I'm afraid, I'm not happy to say that, but I'm afraid that we need really a shock, which is the ones we have until now, we are not enough. We need really a shock to avoid this kind of selfishness, which makes that advanced economies have their own problem, and then they make a lot of speeches about and a lot of pledges, but finally they don't do a lot. Our German friend, for instance, are a good example about that, but France too, and all the European countries, they do something, they don't do a lot. Private sector is concerned about making good deals, which is just normal. That's a purpose for the private sector, but you can't expect from them there will be a leading force for energy transition. And the developing countries, they have enough on their plate to be not able to organize something, and maybe they don't have the strength to do so. So really, then we need a strong shock. We will have it. Unfortunately, we will have it. And at this point in time, we will go back to possible solutions, among which I'm arguing in favor of using SDRs.
Okay. And so we come to Germany, Andreas. Because of course you were set up, and the opening question I asked was, what is the most important consideration for ensuring that the energy transition is just, equitable, and effective? But as we've been hearing, it seems that absent some sort of catastrophe, we are not going to have this energy transition, at least not an equitable one.
Okay, thank you. 7 trillion. 7 trillion. Before we get to the equitable, the just, and the effective, let's look at the size of the problem. It's 7 trillion per year in subsidies that we currently give to the fossil energy industry. IMF figures for 2022 published in 2023. It's the latest year for which we have these compilations. 2022 was a difficult year. Subsidies went up because of the renewed Russian attack on Ukraine and the consequences in the energy markets. But the long-term trend, which was supposed to be broken, is not being broken. We have that amount of money that is either paid by taxpayers in the countries that have systems for collecting taxes, or it's paid by future generations, because part of that subsidy, by the definition, is damages that are caused now and in the future that have to be borne by somebody. So it's not money that is paid to companies, but it is damage that they don't have to compensate. So it's money that they save because they don't have to compensate. It's a little bit complicated. For the OECD, the number is 1.4 trillion US dollars per year. For the European Union, the same year, it is 123 billion. It's enormous figures that we pay to keep up an industry that we know we should close down. And I think we want to put that first before we think about how much the energy transition costs, because it's actually cheaper. It's about 1/4 of the price of the damages that we allow the fossil energy industry to cause today. That puts into perspective the question of the justness, the equitability, and the efficiency or effectiveness of the whole exercise. The first thing we should do is a subsidy reform and eradicate all subsidies going to the fossil energy industry as quickly as possible. Some of the subsidies that we currently pay for the renewable energy is just to compensate for the fact that we need to subsidize them up so that they can compete on the markets where we heavily subsidize the renewables. So we are also saving money on the other side of the equation if we cut the subsidies. It creates enormous fiscal space that can be used for better things. The second most important point to say at the beginning is that renewable energy, combination of wind and solar, plus storage and the smart management systems that you need in between, is now cheaper than anything else. Building new renewable energy systems, including the smart energy management behind that, is cheaper than running existing plants in many parts of the world. Existing coal-fired power plants, existing nuclear power plants are more expensive to run than to build new. So in this situation, all new investment should go into renewable energy, energy storage, and smart energy. In practice, there's still a lot of new investment going into coal, into oil, and into gas, fossil gas. Why is that? It's not because people are stupid. It's because the legislative frameworks actually help the incumbent industries to survive, even though we know intellectually in our minds that they should die. In that context, what is just? You cannot have an effective energy transition that is at the same time just, because the term just in this debate has been framed to mean that those who hold jobs in the fossil industries at the moment need to be compensated. The investors that are investing in that space need to be compensated. That's the definition of the just transition. In Germany, and I'm a taxpayer in Germany, we've paid 40 billion euros in order to compensate the loss of 20,000 jobs in the soft brown coal mining, the lignite mining industry. That is 2 million per job. Actually, they inflated the number of jobs in the industry by a factor of 3, but never mind. 2 million, the residual working time of the workforce in that sector was 7 years. It would have been cheaper, way cheaper, to just pay their salary until the retirement age and shut down. If we had let market forces close down our coal industry, soft coal industry, it would have been bankrupt by 2025 with Russia's renewed attack on Ukraine, perhaps another 2 years on top, but not more. Instead, we have a legislative framework that organizes the phase out to 2038, and we are thinking about. One party says we bring it forward to 2035, others say no, we need to run it longer. We are actually subsidizing the life extension of an industry that is moribund anyway. That's the reality, and that is, I paid, on average, every German paid 500 euros into the pot in order to make that financing of the just transition possible. My family paid, on average, then 4 people, 2,000 euros. In fact, many people don't pay because they don't pay taxes. So I pay probably more than that. So for people, taxpayers in Germany, the word just has a very bitter taste. And I think we need to get out of that mindset that the transition costs money. The transition saves money. Investment should go into the direction anyway. We need to stop the new investment going into the fossil and nuclear industry and make sure that we create the space so that the private money goes into the renewable energy industry, the electrification as quickly as possible, the decarbonization in industry and the transport sector is possible on that basis, and that is the cheaper way. It actually saves money. And then many of the financial instruments that we're discussing, because we have in our minds the idea that we need to compensate existing industries that are still making investments that we know are not going to pay back if we want to decarbonize. So that's the way forward.
Andreas, you introduced some interesting parallels for us, because when we think about climate justice, we typically think about the vulnerable communities, those who are the island nations, Africa, Latin America, and various others. And yet, what you're introducing to us is the concept of vulnerable people within Europe. I think we saw this in France with the Yellow Vest protests against the energy, fuel prices, because of course, as you transition, it's people at the bottom of the ladder who feel that they're paying more for this transition to renewable energy. So then how do we balance these needs? Because you've introduced the concept of justice for people within the developed world, particularly when, as we've been told, the political will doesn't exist. And you've illustrated it beautifully. We're still paying for moribund industries. So how do we balance the need for justice in the developed world, all these people who will lose their jobs, but also the need for justice for other parts of the world which are bearing the brunt of the energy transition?
I do think that it was said that we recognize now, the world recognizes that there is this historic responsibility.
Yes.
I think it bears breaking that down a little bit. There were nations in Europe that started with the coal industry. They had emissions over different periods of time. I would say that responsibility increases from the moment when it was known that this was the wrong way to go. I would put that to 1896. I would excuse any emission before 1896 because people were innocent, because they were ignorant at that time. But the minute Svante Arrhenius explained how carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can and will lead, he actually made a correct calculation of how it would happen, how quickly it would happen. The minute that was out in the scientific publications, anybody still emitting carbon dioxide after that moment shares in the responsibility. Guilt is a strong word, let's call it responsibility. I think it's important to understand that. So in that sense, I fully accept that there should be some sort of recognition of historic responsibilities, and that should play into a compensation for the most vulnerable communities in developing countries, which are practically everywhere. They are on all the coasts where we have the sea level rise. They are on the mountain ranges where erosion because of extreme weather events will increase. It's the vulnerability of the food system to increased extremes in our weather events. And of course, the small island states, especially if they're only that much above the sea level. They have a choice of relocating or converting themselves into floating communities in order to occupy the space that they had.
I think they would ask who pays for that, and that's the point of our
I fully understand. It's actually relatively cheap if you look at the figures that all the countries, and when we say $7 trillion dollars per year in subsidies, this is not just the North. It is in Africa, Libya, Algeria, and Egypt are major contributors to that equation. Many countries, including the oil-producing countries, gas-producing countries, pay enormous subsidies for those industries, and they allow damage to occur. So there are deep pockets, and making the whole of the Maldives a floating community is actually relatively inexpensive at a time when we're thinking about converting harbors into floating infrastructure, because with sea level rise we need to relocate them every few decades anyway, so it may be cheaper to just put them as a floating infrastructure onto the ocean. So it's not a lot of money compared to the money that we put into the maintenance of the fossil energy economy at the moment. It's actually probably cheaper. So we're talking about less money in the future than we are spending on the energy system at this time already. Right. And yes, I agree, the countries with historical responsibility should put up the money in order to compensate or invest in the new infrastructure that may be needed by those vulnerable communities. There's no other way around it. That is a moral imperative.
Ms. Albornoz, I'll come to you because we are now talking about vulnerable communities, which is a point of our conversation, equity. And so from your experience, the opening question I asked was, what is the most important consideration for ensuring that the energy transition is just, equitable, and effective? From your experience, how do we ensure that legal frameworks in developing countries are designed to attract financing, but also that the most vulnerable and marginalized people are catered to?
Sí, muchas gracias.
Yes, thank you very much. My colleague on the panel had put that topic out there for all of you, and it was a very interesting topic at that. It's what's known as historic responsibility, and it's got to do with proportions, dealing with the scale and the level of impact and everything that's gone before historically in regards to this globally unbalanced situation. Now, this debate was dealing with the circumstances that the most vulnerable nations found themselves in, and at the same time we have to tackle dealing with levels of poverty that are really quite substantial, and to improve the situation of parts of the population that are in rural areas are affected by armed conflict. And then at the same time we have to deal with the problems experienced by the developed world. Now, all of this we should do in a way that allows these ideas to converge when the world is still spending 30 billion or whatever the amount is on armament and funding weapons worldwide. So this is something that's a real tension for developing countries constantly. As I said a few moments back, where we haven't been able to overcome these inequalities as regards workers, in the fossil industry that you've just spoken about, they're going to have to deal themselves with the consequence of this change in model, but also to do with the fact that we're talking about countries with governance and democracies that are still very fragile. We've said that Latin America is a continent that has had quite a peaceful trajectory in recent years, something that positions us as a continent where it is possible to think about things community-wise in terms of being able to face up to this demand that there is by international fora to deal with climate change, but not as a result of that are we going to recognise the fact that they're still quite unstable democracies and that fluctuate very frequently indeed. And we have taken a really long time to get over this. And I would say that this is probably where your question emanates from, which is the inequalities that 50% of the world suffers from, specifically women. Women in Latin America experience discrimination, and they are very vulnerable indeed, similar to what goes on in other continents. But this is also marked by a lack of political will on the parts of governments when it comes to mixing the needs of the population with the expectations that are put out there at this type of political forum. So what I'm getting at here is that the perception of developing countries, such as is my country, Chile, is that the levels of debate or of commitment should have a sense of proportionality about them, given the fact that some of us are still developing countries and we're still having to tackle with our own challenges, which are different from those of the richer nations who have failed to meet their commitments on climate financing time and time again. So what am I then going to do as a smaller country, a very skinny, long country, if you look at it on the world map, over there in Latin America? So we have thought about being able to contribute proportionally in terms of legal changes in our regulations and democratic change that allows us to see through a process that would bring through these necessary changes in this sense. And we have reiterated our commitment time and time again in this area, and especially the roles that companies should play, such as that which I'm currently the director of, which has important projects in green hydrogen. And obviously we know that we still have to process fuels and gas. That's still going to remain key at the moment. And so these sectors are fundamental, and this is a role that should be taken up by banks as well when it comes to financing, with different conditions according to the proportion of responsibility attributable to each country, and the demands on each of the respective countries should be differentiated. From my point of view, and I'll insist on this, countries with less levels of development versus more developed countries should be distinguished. And I said this last week in Colombia, not just because there's a scarce commitment to climate change, but also because of these defensors, human beings that are involved in the process of climate change and defenders of the environmental goals, such as Berta Cáceres, an environmentalist, were actually subject to harassment. They've been disappeared. We don't know what actually happened. Berta died, unfortunately. So we don't know this whole mix of circumstances that have to be taken into account. And we're not talking about figures or having to do this on a macro level, but all of this goes through the filter of the differentiation that should be made of the different situations in the case of developing countries.
Agrees with you that the countries that bear the greatest historical responsibility should bear the most cost for the energy transition. My question to you then becomes, given that you've introduced the gender perspective, how do we ensure that women, are protected and benefit from this energy transition? They haven't benefited from the fossil fuel industry. Whatever happens, and you talked about war, you also introduced the concept of proportionality and told us that, we have these defenseless, marginalized communities. What do we need to take into account to make sure that they are protected?
Bueno, allí hay diferentes.
Well, there are different policies that governments can implement. Just to give you an example, the percentage of women living in rural areas and the type of agriculture that carried out today, recycling food or traditional means of production of food. All of this has a direct impact on women who, most of them, live in rural areas. I think that we should include them in the discussion and that the inhabitants of rural regions should be listened to, and they should be given a major role in the civil society. And I think that this is somehow lost because this is a kind of discussion among the elites. I mean, it's only the companies, the equity talking. And I'm saying this specifically regarding what you said concerning the situation of workers in the oil and gas industry, asking about what happens with them, who cares about them, and what role should companies play. And the same applies to the most vulnerable communities. And I have to say this, it is precisely the poorest women who focus in the most inequalitarian region in the world, which is Latin America. So I think that it is up to the countries who should propel a change in behavior to facilitate women leadership, because it would trigger a faster change. We've seen manifold initiatives coming from the grassroots involving women and dealing with climate change, recycling procedures, with a higher commitment to focalized programs that will cater for the specificities of each region.
I'll come to the audience now, because you've heard the perspectives of the panelists. And in your opening responses, you said that inadequate international financing mechanisms were the most significant challenge to funding the global energy transition. So my question to you now, if you take out your AD Connect, is what innovative financial solutions, right, could help make the energy transition more equitable? What innovative financial solutions could help make the energy transition more equitable? Okay. Well, you're answering the question with the question, equity. Over to you, political will. Okay. Equity. Right. So you've answered the question with a question. And so panelists, I come back to you to ask you the same. Okay, no, where?
No, it kicks
No,
in.
it's okay. Political will. Okay. No? Political will. Panelists, I'll ask you to respond to what we're seeing, and I'll come to you, Professor Lopez. Given your experience on the continent, Africa, but also trying to mobilize a political will around economic transformation. How then do we mobilize? We've accepted historical responsibility. How do we mobilize political will, given that we seem to be at a stalemate?
Well, often the expression political will is a cop-out.
Okay.
It's a way of not dealing with the difficult questions. You just say political will and then you solve the problem, Mm-hmm. So it's kind of put it in a shower and, everybody benefits from it. I think it's very important for us to identify with a bit more precision what is it that is not working. So we have the principle. We have debated now for about 30 minutes or so about common but differentiated responsibilities, which is one of the principles of the climate action and the environmental pillars of the United Nations. So nothing really absolutely innovative or new. It's something that we know.
But we've also taken on board the resistance within advanced nations.
I agree. So, but common but differentiated responsibility has been the subject of a lot of interpretation in order basically not to implement the most difficult consequences of doing common but differentiated responsibilities. Let's take your example of Libya, Algeria, and so on. In fact, yes, maybe these governments are subsidizing their fossil fuel industry for the benefit of exporting those commodities for countries that are actually using them to maintain their consumption patterns. So who is responsible? It's the theory of comparative advantages that has been basically framed in a way that puts certain countries in the condition of provider of commodities for the benefit of the world economy with a consumption pattern that does not benefit necessarily those countries the most. So if you go into the colonial frame, it was about exporting commodities. In Africa, it was mostly about that period. Now, fast forward, and today, 35 countries in Africa are considered by UNCTAD in the category of highly dependent in commodities, which is 80% or more of their exports are commodities. So we are exactly in the same frame. It's a colonial frame. Structurally, it has not changed fundamentally. A lot of things are new, but the key element of the economic structure is maintained. So we cannot discuss climate without discussing equity and development. In fact, that's why it has become almost cynical to say that we are going to increase climate finance when in fact what we are doing is relabeling the same money that used to be available for development. There's nothing new. It's also cynical when people say we are going to leverage, so everybody's leveraging the same money. There is nothing new. It's just to leverage. So I'm going to put this so I leverage and the other one will come. So look at the latest announcement that has just been done this week about either replenishment of the World Bank. The news that you read even in the Moroccan newspapers is that the World Bank has been able to mobilize 100 billion. No, it has mobilized 23 billion. But the rest is leveraging. So everybody is leveraging. The problem is that it's always the same money. There is no fresh additionality. So if we really are talking about innovative mechanisms, we have to go deeper into the discussion. Let's take the example of Dominique on the SDRs. It depends whether we are saying it's SDRs the way they are used today, which will be 5% for Africa, 95% for the rest, but mostly for the developed economies? Or is it the SDRs used with a different methodology, which I think is what you mean, which will require a complete overhaul of the way the decision process is taken? the same way as to respond to the challenges that you have put is basically about regulatory frameworks that have to change. You take the Bank of International Settlements, it has just put in place, after the 2008-2009 subprime crisis, a number of measures called Basel III that are basically prohibitive for new entrants into the international banking system to be sustainable. It requires due diligence and stress tests and all battery of requirements that make it very difficult for what is already considered risky jurisdictions, which basically are the African countries and the vulnerable countries. So we are talking on one room about climate finance, and we are going to respond to the climate action and all that. On the other room, we are taking measures that are actually making it impossible for these countries to access finance, period, be it for development or be it for climate, which basically puts them in a situation where it's about, do I pay my debt service, knowing that these countries pay a much higher rate than anybody else. So the interest rates in Africa are average 9%. For Germany, it will be 0%. So, with all due respect, we are not in the same league. So you are in the first league, we are in the 23rd league in terms of access to finance. So we don't access finance. And because of that, we have a discussion that is distorted. It's not just about climate. It's about the word that appeared there and then disappeared. Equity in two senses. Equity in sense of balance, but also equity in sense of real capital that comes to these countries instead of just, concessionality, subsidizing, etc., without actually putting the risk where it belongs, which is the risky part is the planet, because we are in an urgency, and the best returns on investment is to actually put equity in these countries.
Thank you. I'll open the floor to questions. I know you want to respond to that, but I have to say, Professor Carlos has to leave to catch a flight. So if you've got questions for him, now is the time to ask those questions. And I know that there are people behind me, so let me stand so I can see you. Right. Since I've had my back to you, are there any questions on this side? No? Right. Hello, how are you? Okay, great. It took a while. Oh, hello, Nick. I'll come to you and then to you, Nick. Where? Okay, go ahead, please.
Oh, okay, all right. Now, my question is a quick one, all right. What about if a country develops technology for improving and addressing many of the changes of climate change? Are the developed countries going to accept it? For instance, and I'm not defending the case, but you look at what the whole demonization that you see of electric cars from China entering Europe, and the import taxes that want to be imposed, the situation in the United States. So are we adopting double standards here when it comes to, okay, the technology is okay if it comes from a country that is not within the system, that's only in the system, or what about the other ones? Because today is China, tomorrow could be Brazil, Morocco, any other country.
Okay.
Are they going to face the same situation, the same challenges?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Where's the microphone on this side?
Acá, una mujer acá.
There's a lady over there. A man and a woman, right?
Thank you. Let me bring together the spirit of particularly what Dominique and Andres have said. And I'd like to summarize it as communications. Obviously, I was in broadcasting and so on. But the shock, Dominique, you're talking about is happening already. Mm-hmm. But for some reason, the public and the politicians are not connecting on this. And the politicians are not yet willing to engage in the enormity of what has to be done to communicate to reduce emissions. In the United Kingdom, we have a prime minister who said in Baku, it's 81% reductions by 2035. How on earth is that going to be achieved? And Andreas, picking up on your point as well about the relationship with what you said about we keep paying for industries which actually can no longer survive. How is it possible that the political class can actually engage on the enormity of what has to be done and communicate with the public? I come from a country which fortunately has another 4.5 years of the same government. That gives them the kind of leeway which most other countries don't have. But I have to say, as an independent, that I worry that they're worried about talking about the accuracy and how frankly they've got to talk about what's going to be the impact on industries, whether it be the car industry, the steel industry, or whatever, that there's no real nerve to confront the enormity of what has to be done.
Thank you, Nick. Please ask your question, and then we'll come to you.
Nadia Motea, professor, University Mohammed V. We know that when it comes to climate finance, this can translate into heavy costs beyond what climate action already requires. In 2019-2020, over 60% of climate finance enrolled borrowing funds all around, and I speak under the control of Mr. Strauss-Kahn, enrolled around $384 billion. Only $47 billion came with low cost or concessional interest rate. What has been done so far to solve this vital issue? Is it a resistance to change, political will, as we already mentioned, or is it only a commodity of letting the boat as they are, letting things as they are rather than rock the boat? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And we'll take a final question from you. We'll allow them to answer, and then we'll come back. And I see you all. Is that all right? Thank you. Go ahead.
Bonjour tout le monde. Ce n'est pas une question.
Hello, everyone. I don't have a question, but rather a comment. My name is Mr. Adiel. I am an international expert in energy and the environment. Given how this discussion has unfolded, I feel compelled to bring forth some critical issues, in particular for Africa.
And so can I ask you to hold on your comments so he can respond to the questions that have been asked, because he's leaving this panel.
Que je peux avoir 1 minute?
1 minute.
May you grant me 1 minute?
En Afrique, il y a tout d'abord.
In Africa, there's first and foremost an issue of access to energy, with more than 600,000 people more than 600,000 people in Africa don't have access to energy. There's also the energy mix, which is dominated by biomass. There's also a huge potential of renewable energy, but which unfortunately is untapped. But to use it, investments are required, and for that, it's important to have valid governance, legal frameworks that are suitable. And also, this needs to be compounded with natural gas and energy storage to handle intermittent issues. So I addressed the governance, which is critical. There's also energy efficiency. The best energy is the one that we don't consume. In most African countries that are developing, well, there is a huge potential of savings.
The panel. So I'll start with you, and then we'll go around, because I think you wanted to come in, particularly on some provocation in Professor Lopez's prior remarks. Go ahead.
I didn't provoke him. Huh? Cannot afford that.
I'm used to that.
No, I'm just going to pick 3 quick points, because I think, for the sake of others contributing is very important, not to monopolize. I think it's very important for us to bear in mind one aspect that has not been underlined enough, is that there is now a way of dealing with energy transitions that has been tested in a number of countries with some degree of success, that includes, making sure that you phase out fossil fuels in a way that is commensurate with, the realities of the economy. So you are not going to be, having targets and ambitions that you proclaim but don't have any intention of implementing, but rather you try to be a bit more sustainable, particularly in new investments. So you privilege the new investments, you try to phase out in a rational way. Case in point, Brazil. But I think it's also very important for us to bear in mind that, we always throw this thing about governance issues that you just mentioned now again. But let's be clear. If we are talking about Africa, because that's where, the deficit of energy access is the highest. If we are talking about Africa, I have some news. And the news is that in terms of default in infrastructure projects in the world, the region that has the least defaults is Africa. So this is not what people think. And the reason is actually very easy to explain is because, to get any project of infrastructure approved in Africa, you have like 5 years of negotiation because everybody thinks it's so risky that, it's sort of waterproofed in such a way that eventually there are no defaults. It's a very marginal default, much higher in Europe, much higher even in the US in relation to Africa. So that's not, the problem is not governance. If the issue is about, whether there are good projects, well, the return on investment, I have news for you. The return on investment on infrastructure projects, the highest is in Africa. So let's be clear. There is a narrative, there is a discourse that does not correspond to the reality. And this is what, is translated into risk perceptions. And risk perceptions is not just about development in Africa in general, it's also the same problem we have in relation to climate. And Nick, I think one of the reasons the politicians don't actually embrace the level of ambition that is required is precisely because of risk perception not being as high as they should be. I rest my case.
Thank you very much. And Nick's point on communication was directly to you, Andreas, and to Mr. Strauss-Kahn.
Well, two quick points. First, I don't always agree with Nick, but this time he's 100% right. The way we can find to have the brain of politician and big corporate manager understanding what's really going on, or at least they understand, but decide to act in accordance with what they feel is absolutely crucial. What we can do in this direction is, of course, necessary. But then I come to Carlos' point. You say, okay, fine, SDRs, why not SDRs, but not in the usual way, because the usual way, 5% only goes to Africa and so on. First, they need the SDRs. Because what you say is, we in Germany, we were unable to solve the social problem created by carbon and by the carbon factories. So to solve it in a political way which will maintain some social peace, you need resources, even if you're Germany. So the question is not only to find the money for developing countries, but also for developed countries. We are the place where the carbon is going out. Germany is for 25% of the carbon emission in Europe, and to help them to solve the problem at home. Then, of course, there's also the problem of some developing countries. So I'm not saying it has to be only 5% for Africa. You know what I mean about this. But we can do it in a way where the infrastructure problem you were just mentioning can be not solved, but at least helped. To need to do so, we need resources. It's too easy to say it's not a question of resources at all, it's a question of something else. It's basically a question of resources. And we have the resources. But then we come to, do we really want to do something? I agree with you. To say it's a political will, it's a bit easy to say because it's a way to avoid the problem. But at the end of the day, it comes back to the political will. That is, are the people who are managing the planet, bad or well, but rather bad than well, decide to do something. And if they decide to do something, we have the tools. There is no way to invent some new mechanism. We have the tools, we know how it works, we know the drawbacks, we know the advantages. Today we need it. And the sooner the better. I agree that the shock may be already here, but people have to open eyes and to do something.
Okay, Andreas?
I cede to Carlos if you want to have a last word. Okay,
Okay.
all right. Then I would say technology acceptance, Marcus, on that one. China is driving down the prices for solar panels, for storage facilities. Lithium is now at a historic low again after some rise. Wind power and electric vehicles. China will ask for a carbon credit as a facilitator of carbon reduction in other countries because of the products they deliver. I invite everybody to think, as we allocate responsibilities, historic responsibilities, to think about how to give credit to those who enable solutions later on. Nick, why governments can't change their orientation is partly because of regulatory capture. The fossil industry is an incumbent industry. It is deeply embedded in the power structures of all our countries. And they're currently using the windfall profits from 2022 and 23, well, 21 as well, in order to increase their lobbying power across the world and financing think tanks, financing journalism, buying up media. It's really hard to get truthful narratives across. And I say that because everybody says the energy transformation in Germany is failing. No, it has succeeded. We are at more than 50% of our electricity is now from renewable sources. And because we started with that process just in time, early enough, we were able to wean ourselves of direct imports of Russian gas within 11 months. It would have been impossible if we had had the energy system structure of 10, 20 years earlier. We have a security benefit already, and we have already cashed it in the conflict, the energy war that we had with Russia in 2021. So there is a real benefit there. Last comment is I'm with Dominique Strauss-Kahn and Anna Palacio in her final statement in the last panel. They talked about we don't need innovation, we need the right packages with the right de-risking in order to mobilize private capital with the right risk mixture and rate of return. And it needs to be tailor-made for the countries and for the technologies and for the projects. It is really difficult to do that in a generalized manner. At the macroeconomic level, you can set the framework, but the investment decisions, they're individual decisions, and they need to be de-risked, and they need to be protected from a regulatory interference at the project level. That is where it needs to be.
Thank you. Sir.
Thank you. Great discussion. Rabia Mukhtar, Policy Center for the North House and Texas A&M University. There's more to energy transition than has been discussed. I'm a farmer in a small village. I'm off-grid, and I have all of a sudden, with the energy transition, I have access to power. Look at the development opportunities that are out there. I have power. I can plow my field, I can have cold storage, and I can transport. All of these developmental issues are not in the discussion. They should be, because it's a development opportunity for small-scale farmers all over the world in developing countries. Why that is not in the discussion today and in the energy transition in general? We're focusing on decarbonization. The energy transition is much more than decarbonization. It's much more than financing. It's a development issues all over the world, especially in developing countries and in small farmers, households.
Okay. I think the title of this panel was Who Bears the Cost of the Energy Transition?
But that's an important element in this whole discussion, that it should be part of that.
All right, thank you. Yes, madam.
Merci. Merci.
Thank you, Larishi. I'm an economist from Morocco. So the transition model towards a post-fossil fuels world is in construction, but definitely not fast enough. And the pace of reforms is most definitely isn't catching up with the reforms themselves. And the idea here isn't to be optimistic or pessimistic by any means. I'm wondering whether the involvement of the private sector for the decarbonation of the economy is the main challenge at hand. It's true that there are new strategies that have been devised, be it in Morocco or elsewhere, to develop climate finance.
9 minutes left and lots of questions.
Je parle de la finance climatique.
So I'm speaking to climate finance and the mobilization of private financing. So the question I'd like to ask is, how can we identify the drivers that would ensure the profitability of green finance? Because private sector obviously speaks to profit. And my question is for Mr. Dominique Strauss-Kahn.
I'm concerned, as I was earlier on, about the language we use. Once we talk about developing and develop, I'm not developing towards the USA. It's not for me a model of development. And so I worry that these assumptions that are in the comments that are being made here are going to undermine our ability to emerge with the kind of point that he's making, that we don't have to go through the path of the way Europe or America or other have developed. And what I like to hear, what I liked very much, and I would like to follow up with him later on, is there are ways in which the 600 million Africans who don't have electricity can have it or can have access to energy. But if our model is Europe and America and wherever else, we're not going to get anywhere. So I really am urging for a different approach and a different development model that we need to interrogate.
Thank you.
My name is Charles Dahan. I'm a strategic advisor. I worked a little bit in Africa. We are talking about transition and the cost of energy in Africa. Really, most countries in Africa don't need transition. They just need electricity. And we are at the point where most of the European or American company or energy company are mostly public company with shareholders, and all this company, and I've been at the COP 27, 28, they have not, the owners and the shareholders are not willing to let their money go. And that's the problem of today.
Thank you. We'll take one last one from you, sir. If you could pass a microphone to him. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Hung Tran from the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. Living in Washington, D.C., I have a very surrealist impression of the discussion today. We talk as if we were meeting prior to November 4th, 2024, without knowing that in a few weeks' time, Donald Trump will assume the office of presidency of the U.S. He will take the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement again, and there's talk that he will take the U.S. out of the UN Framework Treaty, which sponsor and set up the 29 COPs that we have so far.
Sir, could you make your point, please? I'm watching
the point is, the reality is that the progress, slow as it is under the COPs, risk being reversed in the next 4 years, and we have not talked about it.
Thank you. All right. So, panelists, I'll come to you.
Two small points. You first, and sir, if you may. You're right. That's why I said, will the energy transition take place? That's the main question we have now. It's not only to how to finance, but because the reason you say, I was not as explicit as you were, but I'm very pessimistic about it, and I'm not quite sure any kind of energy transition will really go on. Second, I like the way you say they don't need, Africa don't need that transition, they need electricity. Absolutely right. But look, you have to implement a power plant in any African countries. You can do it for a cost of 100 in a traditional way, or 150 in a green way. The question is who's going to pay the 50 for you? And then we come to the question of global financing to help giving you the 50 to make something which is clean rather than something which is traditional. So you need electricity, but there's no reason why this electricity will be the old way, as you said. You can do it in a new way. It costs more. Then we come back to the question of today, who bears the cost? And to the answer I gave, I'm not going to repeat.
Thank you. Madam Albanos?
Well, I think we can conclude several things. The energy transition or the generation of energy is different for each continent based on their own reality. And it seems I'm saying the obvious, but it is obvious. And this is a slow process that will take a long time. And in this fora, normally, what we find is it seems there's a side trying to find the solutions and take the responsibility, their historical responsibility. And then there's the other side who are on the other side of the world trying to compensate the responsibilities and be more focused. So I think that it is important to coordinate. It's important that developing countries are coordinated, and therefore we need to change the way we do things. Some time ago, because of the COVID pandemic, countries got together, and together, for good or for bad, they decided to take on some reforms, technological reforms. They developed vaccines. We don't know good or bad. We still don't know the results yet. But I think that to find a positive outlook, we need the humankind to be more coordinated so that we look at all the specificities and somehow we can avoid all these global pacts that invisibilize the poor countries.
Andreas?
Yes, thank you. Access to energy and off-grid for small farmers anywhere. In North America, they call it grid defection. And I, living in the suburb of Berlin, I'm already thinking about how much solar panels I can put on my roof and what do I need in order to cut myself off the grid. Africa can spare itself the trouble by buying off-grid systems. They are 300 to 500 euros per household, solar panel, management system, storage facility, everything you need for the basic electricity needs. As a modern energy, allows you communication, allows you direct banking because you can charge your smartphone on it. It's enough for a household. A system for a little workshop that repairs bicycles or motorbikes or farm equipment is a little bit more expensive, but it is retail investment so small that statistically it appears as consumption. It is not considered to be investment in the energy infrastructure because the small size of each of those decisions make it look like somebody bought a new television. That is what we have. The total cost of providing electricity to all of the 600 million Africans that don't have it at the moment, per household, difficult to do the household, I guess it's about 60 billion euros or dollars to electrify everybody by buying the off-grid, direct current, low voltage systems. And I say that because it is just a way, not as a leapfrogging, which implies that you're developing in the same direction, but taking a shortcut into where the countries will be in the future.
So, Andreas, I'll cut you
and
off.
I'll stop you there.
Yes. Thank you. Because we have about a minute for you to make your closing remarks. We have a minute. And so I would like to ask you, panelists, if you could implement one immediate action to advance the energy transition in terms of cost bearing, what would it be?
You mean immediate action?
Yes.
It's just people going in the street.
Sounds like a very French response.
Because you have to push the government.
Okay. Take to the streets. Andreas?
I would do two things. One is abolish all subsidies for the fossil industry and make environmental concerns conditional on all types of financing.
Okay. Madam Albanos?
Yo creo que el fortalecimiento.
I think that we need to strengthen democracies and also governments and also have efficient commitments. And those are the best mechanisms that we've known so far in order to achieve the different goals of humankind. So there are three different solutions for a problem that seems to not have a single solution.
Panelists, you've been awfully generous with your time and your insights, so we thank you. Audience, I apologize for those to those of you who didn't get to ask questions, but thank you very much for your engagement. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your participation this morning. We will now break for lunch at the pavilion. Under the high patronage of His Majesty King Mohammed VI, the Policy Center for the New South is organizing the 13th edition of the Atlantic Dialogues Conference. scheduled to take place from December 12 to 14, 2024, in Rabat, Morocco. This flagship event will convene over 400 distinguished leaders from the public and private sectors, civil society, international organizations, think tanks, and the media across the Atlantic Basin, fostering open and candid discussions on pivotal cross-regional and cross-sectoral challenges. This year's conference marks a significant evolution, transitioning from annual thematic focuses to a broader, more inclusive approach emphasizing the wider Atlantic space's core values and strategic importance. The agenda will delve into critical topics such as geoeconomics, regional security, democracy, migration, and the energy transition, with a particular emphasis on the African Atlantic region. Participants will engage in over 11 plenary sessions, interactive town halls, thematic breakout dinners, and intimate night owl sessions, all designed to encourage meaningful dialogue. The Atlantic Dialogue's Emerging Leaders 2024 program will bring together more than 40 young changemakers across the Atlantic. These emerging leaders will participate in a tailored leadership, policy and networking program, fostering intergenerational dialogue and bridging generational and perception gaps. Building on the previous 12 editions, this 13th edition will be a platform conducive to navigating the complexities of the Atlantic region and working collaboratively towards a more integrated and prosperous wider Atlantic. For more information, visit our website, atlanticdialogues.org.